This is going to be a video on my Beatles book collection and Beatles related book collection. Try and go through as many books as I can. If they're interesting to look at, I'll try and go through some of the books. These are not in any particular order. This one is Pattie Boyd, George's first wife's autobiography, and George Harrison's autobiography, I Me Mine. First Beatles book I ever owned was Shout. This was Philip Norman's biography. I think it came out in the 80s, at least that's when I got it. Beatles and Their Generation, a really good read. First information I ever had about the Beatles beyond what was on their album covers. Second book I think I ever got was this one, The Love You Make, an Insider Story of the Beatles, which was by Peter Brown and Stephen Gaines. I think Peter Brown might have been their publicist. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know if that's a first edition or not. I don't know how to tell, really. Bob Spitz, The Beatles. This is Meet the Beatles by Stephen Stark. Sort of a book about the cultural relevance of the Beatles and how they shaped the 60s. This is a book about 1964 tour by Larry Kane, who I think gave a number of interviews with the Beatles back in the day. When They Were Boys, which covers the Beatles' early years. Covering the Beatles' early recorded years. I hope there'll be more volumes to come on this one, but this is Mark Lewison's The Beatles All These Years. Very extensive book. This is all about the breakup of the Beatles and the opportunities that they had to get together and the close calls where they actually almost reunited, but it obviously never came to pass. A very interesting read if you're curious about that whole story. This is a book about Yellow Submarine. There aren't a whole lot of pictures in here. This is just about the development of the film. Al Brodak's, who did the animation for the film and the concepts and whatnot. This is an edition of the Hunter Davies biography on the Beatles, the first biography on the Beatles, I believe. And this is, I read the news today, the Beatles lyrics, which is very interesting because it has reproductions of Beatles handwritten lyrics for many of their songs and a little write-up. And it's interesting, some of the changes and the whole evolution of the songs. So it goes through album by album. And then it has the actual printed lyrics, which if you own the white album, you already have those lyrics. Obviously they're on the poster, but this one was written on the back of an envelope. This was Glass Onion. And I got this one. My daughter got this for my birthday last year. It's called Visualizing the Beatles, and it is a very enjoyable read. It shows how the Beatles look, changed over the years, just different artifacts, kind of pop culture references, things that were going on at the time, the distribution of singing on each of the tracks. goes year by year, album by album. All the way through to the end of their career. So it's a real fun book to have. Just really reminds you how many times they changed, their look changed throughout their career, what guitars they used. 100 Best Beatles Songs, according to Stephen Spignesi and Michael Lewis. So this is just their own personal top 100 list, which I always find interesting. I'm always curious what other people, how they rank their Beatles songs. So number 1, A Day in the Life. Number 2, Strawberry Fields Forever. I find it hard to argue with that. 3, Let It Be, which I might not chart that high, but I never wrote a book either. Yesterday. 4. I'm not going to go through all these, but just the top 5. All You Need Is Love. It's got little facts about each of the song. What is the song about? And little interesting tidbits about the recording and the song itself. And then some of my favorite books of all are those written by Bruce Peyser. This was the one that came out in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the White Album. Which it's really hard if you got the box set, the 50th anniversary box set. It's hard to beat the book that came with that. But this still, I find this a really enjoyable read. And of course, like all his books, he's got magazine covers and the original album artwork and labels and advertisements. Just really puts you in that period of time. I highly recommend his books. If you don't own any, it's definitely worth your while and the investment to include one of his books, if not all of his books, if you can find them in your collection. And this was the one that came out in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of Abbey Road. And it's got some stuff from the Get Back sessions, but primarily, you know, focuses on the year 1969, but a bulk of it to do surrounding the Abbey Road album. There's a Beatles bootleg, which sort of fed into the whole Paul is dead phenomenon that was going on. Got a couple books about Sgt. Pepper. Sgt. Pepper at 50. And this has to do with sort of similar to the Bruce Peyser book, what was going on leading up to and around the time that Sgt. Pepper was released. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album The Beatles and the World in 1967. divided into an A side and a B side. Which I really enjoyed for the photographs, but the information also is a good read. So again, it's hard to beat the book that came with the Sgt. Pepper 50th anniversary if you have the deluxe edition with the hardcover, but you know, if you're not able to make that investment, this I guess is, you know, the next best thing. Then this is a fun little book. It's basically Where's Waldo, but it includes the Beatles. It's called Where Are the Beatles? Find the Iconic Fab Four. And so it has just different scenes whereby you need to locate where are John, Paul, George, and Ringo. This one is Abbey Road. The Bed In for Peace. The Indian Retreat. So you get the idea. But especially if you've got kids, you'd have a lot of fun with that book. Some of these are jammed in behind here, so I'll have to go through a little later. This is a good Harry Benson book. He was a photographer in the early years of the Beatles, so this has got some great photographs in it. Some of my favorite photographs, actually. Beatles having a pillow fight, and John and Cynthia en route to America. So a great book to have as part of your collection. One of the other early books that I owned, this was Nicholas Schaffner, the late Nicholas Schaffner's The Beatles Forever, which is kind of a visual and written history of the Beatles. Kind of some cool pictures of memorabilia. And then back there it's called Images of the Beatles, which is also a book that's got pictures of the Beatles. I won't pull that out. I got this one at a used record store years and years ago, and I think it was put out in the late 70s because it doesn't address John's death. Just happens to be autographed by the authors. But it's kind of alphabetically every song, every B-side, A-side, people, characters in the songs, movies, solo albums, also, and solo songs were included. And some pictures. So his Rolling Stones, George Harrison tribute after he passed away. Life magazine's George Harrison tribute. The Imagine John Lennon book, which came out in conjunction with the film from the 80s. which has some Beatles pictures, mostly focused on John, of course. And then this came out the same year, I believe it was last year, when John had the John Lennon Imagine album deluxe set came out. And this is a really great book. Which are photographs, lyrics, reproductions of lyrics, all from around that period. It's got interviews with people who were part of the recording sessions. Stills from the, have you ever seen the video of Imagine, the one that John, the movie that John made with Yoko, which is sort of like a video diary. It has videos for the album Imagine. There's some stills from that. And also the blueprint of Tittenhurst Park. Was that the name of his? I can't believe I can't think of the name of it. But anyway, it's the blueprint for the enormous house that he lived in that's featured in the Imagine film. Pictures, like long shot panoramic pictures of each room, and pictures of John and Yoko from that period. So a really great read. I highly recommend it. This is just a book of John Lennon, pictures of John Lennon through the years. The infamous Albert Goldman, The Lives of John Lennon. Ray Coleman's John Lennon biography. Philip Norman, The Life, John Lennon. This is John Lennon, The Man, the Myth, the Music, The Definitive Life, which is by Tim Riley. Starting Over, which talks about the recording of his final album, Double Fantasy by Ken Sharp. This book is Memories of John Lennon, in which different poets, artists, other celebrities talk about John Lennon and their relationship and memories of him. Paul McCartney, Many Years from Now, which is the closest thing to a Paul McCartney autobiography that exists right now, I think. Fab, which is a Paul biography. This one's a briefer Paul biography. A Life by Peter Ames Carlin. This is McCartney by Christopher Sanford. Man on the Run, which is a chronicle of the 1970s and Paul's life and albums and recordings. And then Philip Norman's The Life, Paul McCartney. That is part one of my book collection, and I will be doing a part two. I hope you enjoyed, and feel free to comment below.